I have a distinct recollection of 1 year ago. It was actually March the 4th. 1 year ago on March the 4th, I was speaking to an organization. It was a young president's organization. And the timing was such that the date stands out in my mind. They asked me if I would please speak about the interconnection between conspiracy and the current political environment. And in doing some research about what were then hot conspiracies, I stumbled onto the fact that on the very night that I was speaking to this group, hotel rates at some hotels in Washington, D.C. had doubled, including in particular the Trump properties, the former post office, the one that he's now selling. Why was there such a demand at certain hotel properties in Washington, D.C. on March the 4th of last year, 2021? Because that was a date that was a watershed moment for QAnon followers who were convinced that Donald Trump would return, and on that day, he would be sworn in as the 19th president of the United States. And you're saying to yourself, wait a minute, 19th? The idea was that Trump would return as the 19th president of the United States, the first legitimate president since Ulysses S. Grant, with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo as his vice president. Why? Because the 4th of March is the original date that presidents were inaugurated, and Inauguration Day changed January 20 with the passage of the 20th Amendment in 1933, the same year that FDR ended the gold standard. I forget, frankly, how it all related to the gold standard, but I thought, what a great way to reference the subject matter of the speech, that here I am standing in front of a couple hundred people when others are in D.C. expecting Donald Trump's second coming. Anyway, it was also at about that time that I thought, I need to know more about QAnon and Q and what is this all about? There's an HBO 6-part miniseries that I then watched, which laid out a lot of the information that I was up until then unaware of. It was called Into the Storm, and it educated me about characters who include Frederick Brennan, who started a message board that was then used by a father-son pair called Jim and Ron Watkins. Every one of these individuals' characters. There's someone else who's further in the background of the whole QAnon subject that factors into this as well. And you're left not knowing who exactly is Q and how did the movement get started. That is until now. Because David Kirkpatrick, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner from the New York Times, had an exhaustive analysis over the weekend. It's right now in all of my social media that sheds light on not only the origin, but also who is Q. He's here now to explain. David, thank you so much for your time. For the uninitiated, the story begins in the fall of 2017 on a message board where a message gets posted, "Open your eyes. Many in our government worship Satan." Where was that posted? And speak to me about the context as we now understand it.
So that was posted to a fairly freewheeling, chaotic message board, 4chan. 4chan is full of all kinds of speech that is not welcome elsewhere, often including pornography, white supremacy. This was a politically incorrect message board that this popped up on. And it was just another little bit of craziness amid all the craziness. But it was noticed by a South African software developer and tech writer named Paul Ferber. And he became, by his own telling, one of the first people to promote that message. It was one of the first from the account known as Q. Or Q Clearance Patriot, as he sometimes wrote, had written one previous message replying to something, some speculation about Hillary Clinton and whether she would be arrested, that kind of thing. But this was his first real message. And it was the one that Ferber, in his own account, noticed first and began to promote.
And Ferber, like the Watkins father-son duo and Brennan, all four of them have all said, "Hey, I'm not the guy. I'm not Q." Correct?
Yeah, correct. Right. I mean, to be a QAnon believer is, if you're part of the movement, then the sine qua non is believing that there is a Q who's an actual military insider who has some security clearance and is not, for example, a South African tech journalist and software developer.
So at the end of Into the Storm, there is an exchange with Ron Watkins, who seems to admit that he's behind Q. But in light of what you're here to discuss, that appears not to be the case.
Well, I would say it's not the full story, right? So, what struck me digging into this with the advantage of these analyses is, Paul Ferber, one, somehow picked that message out of just a slew of craziness, right? So how did he do that? Two, that message, it alludes to the Pizzagate theory, which at that time had been debunked. You remember the Pizzagate theory, this kind of crazy online fantasy that liberal pedophiles were trafficking children from the basement of a Washington restaurant. A crazy guy with a gun who believed the theory ran in thinking he's going to save the children. He finds no children, no basement, and he leaves kind of confused. All this is on the news. We all knew that. So how many people still believe Pizzagate after all that? Well, Ferber was one of them. So this message rehashes the whole Pizzagate thing. Ferber thought that whole thing was a false flag operation and that there were still children being trafficked from the basement of that restaurant. And so did the author of Q. And then that same message goes on to refer to something really obscure, this idea of a so-called Operation Mockingbird, which was a alleged and, to my mind, never proven CIA scheme to manipulate the news media. Well, Paul Ferber knows all about that. That's one of his many obsessions. So there's a lot of circumstantial reason to think that the person who wrote that first message had a lot in common with Paul Ferber. Pizzagators, Operation Mockingbird, paying attention to this weird message late at night. What I did was engage with a couple of European firms that specialize in forensic linguistics, who take a text and run it through a computer that learns to recognize the text, the subtle patterns in the writing of the writer, so that it can spot other texts by that same person, right? It's good for authorship identification. And they took the whole body of all of Q's writing, all the many Q messages, and they ran it through their machines, two different firms, two different processes, and they ran a whole bunch of likely suspects through their machines. And they came out with a conclusion that actually it was mainly Ferber who did the writing for the first few months of Q. So Ferber is really the guy who played the biggest role in inventing Q and the whole mythology. And then Watkins, who'd been a kind of collaborator in the early Q, took it over. So around beginning of 2018, Watkins becomes the main writer behind Q. And around that time, if you were paying close attention, you would have seen that Paul Ferber, who'd been the earliest and loudest Q promoter, starts saying, wait a second, Q has been hijacked. Q is no longer authentic. No one listens to him. The craze has got its own momentum and it's off and running. But it's no coincidence in retrospect, now that we see these analyses, that Ferber was upset and felt that Q was an imposter because Q is no longer him. Watkins had taken it over entirely.
In other words, these two independently operating linguistic detective teams, one of them Swiss, one of them French, each perform an analysis and they come to the same conclusion in terms of who is Q.
That's right. That's right. And how these computers can identify a writer from a text is, complicated math, complicated computer science, but it works. It's testable. Once they train the machine to recognize your writing, if they put a text by me in front of it, it's got a 99% chance of knowing the difference. If they put a text by you, a new one in front of it, it's got a 99% chance of identifying you as the author. So it's testable. It's helped detectives solve murder cases based on, faked suicide notes or fake text messages, one in the UK, one in the US. and it comes up in a lot of court cases now as evidence. So it's a legitimate science. It's not foolproof, and these authors don't rule out, these scientists, don't rule out the possibility that there was some other contributor, especially during that early period when they see a kind of collaboration, mostly from Ferber with a little bit of Watkins. But given the circumstantial evidence around all this, given the history of Q, they feel, and it's pretty convincing, that these are the two main authors, these two guys, Ferber in South Africa and Ron Watkins, Ron Watkins, who was then based in the Philippines.
You point out in your reporting that this is a sort of a more sophisticated analysis than that which was used to discern who was the author of the Federalist Papers, noting that James Madison favored whilst over while. Alexander Hamilton tended to write upon instead of on. And then sort of the modern incarnation is a technology that has allowed the unmasking of Ted Kaczynski or confirmed that J.K. Rowling had written a 2013 mystery called Cuckoo's Calling.
Yeah, right. And that one is good because in a lot of these cases, they use this software to try to make arguments over did or did not, Shakespeare write this play centuries ago. With J.K. Rowling, when she was caught, she fessed up. She said, okay, you got me. The computer's right. That was my work. So that was a kind of notable validation. For years, English professors basically had done these kind of close reading, and they can say, look, I through my expertise have noticed these idiosyncratic telltale variations. I can tell that, this author is behind text X and text Y. But there was always more kind of art than science there because you couldn't take that method and test it. You couldn't quantify, how often this scholar was correct in his assessments. With the computers, you can. So the computer technology is a way of using machine learning to do what those skilled, by hand linguistic detectives have done previously.
There was a comment that was appended to your reportage in the New York Times that got a lot of reaction, and here's what it said. Good analysis, a compliment to you, but sadly the diehard fans of Q won't accept any scientific evidence as to who wrote these bizarre posts because they're so vested into the conspiracy, they will just say it's another example of the deep state. No matter what kind of evidence is provided, believers in cults have an explanation as to why the evidence isn't true or persuasive. Sadly, there's probably some truth in that observation. You agree?
Yeah, gotta be. There's been a lot of evidence that QAnon was bunk, right? I'm not breaking the news that QAnon is bunk.
Right.
At the same time, I work for a newspaper, and just because QAnon believers are not going to be persuaded, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to get to the bottom of it. So it's worth knowing who is behind it. It's worth knowing it partly because some people on the left, in their own feverish conspiracy theories, imagined that this was cooked up by Team Trump.
Right.
That someone
or Mike
Trump
Flynn
was behind this whole book.
Right.
Yeah, right. Maybe Mike Flynn. But also, you can't help but hope that the accretion of new information will, if not discredit, then at least demystify QAnon. Part of what keeps the myth going is the sexiness of the mystery. Who is Q? And to the extent that there is now a body of work out there that I hope I've contributed to that says, actually, here's Q. He's a middle-aged software developer and tech writer outside Johannesburg. That's Q. Or it's Ron Watkins, a guy in the Philippines with a strong interest in porn. That's Q. It takes away, hopefully it takes away some of the fun, if you will, of the who is Q game.
And it is fun on one hand, but it's also pretty serious stuff because your reporting also discusses that some polls indicate millions of people still believe that Q is a top military insider whose messages have revealed that former President Trump will save the world from this cabal of deep state Democratic pedophiles. Q has been silent for quite some time. Has anything filled that vacuum? Any person, any movement, any particular site?
Not that I know of, and honestly, if I knew of it, I'm not sure I'd want to promote it by naming it here. But you're right. The FBI continues to consider QAnon a potential terrorist threat. So people who believe this conspiracy theory also tend to believe that quote unquote patriots like themselves may need to use violence to try to restore the rightful order in their view. And not just David Kirkpatrick of the New York Times, but actually the FBI continues to worry about what they might get up to, as their initial conspiracy theories have not come to pass.
And David, of course, we all saw the signs that were being carried by some of the folks who were there on January 6th a year ago.
Yeah, that's right. The QAnon myth played a big role in those events. It's clear that many of the attackers from their signs, also from the prosecutions against some of them who faced charges, many of them were motivated by this whole bizarre system of myths.
And finally, so what's the very latest from Ferber and the Watkins about your reporting?
I haven't heard from Watkins since the article came out. He'd been speculated about extensively as Q, and frankly, I suspect he's got an ambivalence about that, because on the one hand, he denies writing as Q. You have to deny it if you're a QAnon believer. On the other hand, he's running for Congress in a Republican primary in Arizona, and his main claim to fame, the main reason for his support, such as he has, is his association with the QAnon movement. So he's got to be sort of positive towards the movement, and indeed he was. So I think he's kind of walking this fine line. I'm with Q, but I'm not Q. Maybe I am Q. Who knows? Ferber was fairly matter of fact in his denials to me. And if I can speculate, as a journalist, I shouldn't say things I can't prove, but just to talk about what I was feeling when I spoke with him, I felt like he might be feeling a little bit left out. As all the speculation is centered on Watkins, Ferber, who's the real, genius, if you will, behind cooking up this whole hoax, has not gotten that much credit or blame, depending on who you're talking to. And I wouldn't be surprised if, on some level, he was gratified to see his work identified.
David, that was really a nice piece of work, because having read in on the subject and having watched that mini-series, of course, I wanted to know the answer, and I'm absolutely convinced that you've now unlocked it. Thank you so much for your willingness to be here to discuss it.
It's a pleasure.
David Kirkpatrick is a Pulitzer Prize winner from the New York Times' most recent book, Into the Hands of the Soldiers, Freedom and Chaos in Egypt and the Middle East. I'll be back right after this.